we do appreciate everybody coming. Joining me is Ryan Bertrand from Transamerica. And as I say, we're glad you're all here. You should have 2 handouts. Everything we talk about are in the books. And of course, as we proceed, if you have questions, stop us. And then afterwards, if you want to speak to any of us in our office, we're always happy to do so. In 1990, we founded Carver Financial Services with the idea of making people's lives better. And that means different things to different people. Might mean more time, might mean more money, more flexibility. But one of the things that we found is, as important as growing assets and growing time, is protecting those things and also protecting our lifestyles. And that's really what this evening's about. Not just protecting assets, but figure out caregiving for you and perhaps people you're caring for. How many of you guys are caregivers for somebody else at this point? It's quite a few. How many of you know somebody that a friend or a family is taking care of them? Quite a few of you. And there's a tremendous amount of stress involved with that that we're going to touch upon tonight. Now, what's the risk? When we talk about a long-term care event, it's a little bit of a misnomer. I like to think about it, if somebody's going to need some form of care at some point, there's a 70% chance, if you're over 65, you are going to require some type of care. If you're married, there's a 91% chance one of the 2 spouses will require care. Now, it could be temporary, it could be long-term, it could be someone coming into the home, but 91% of married couples at some point are going to need some care. Now, how many of you guys have car insurance? Everybody. How many of you have homeowners insurance? Well, the odds of collecting on either of those is about 25%. Most people over their lifetime, there's a 25% chance, or 25% of individuals will have a major claim on either one of those at some point. But again, we just said 70% of people have a long-term care claim, and most people don't insure for long-term care. Now, the challenge is it's getting very expensive and more difficult to do that. And we're going to touch on that today too. In Ohio, there's only a few carriers left because people are pulling out of the state. Now, a lot of people think, well, I don't need that type of protection because I have health insurance or I have Medicare or I'm a VA, I have VA benefits. And the problem is, whether it's TRICARE, which is the veterans benefits, or it's Medicare, they typically do not cover non-medical caregiving, especially if you want to stay in your home. Our view with some of this, whether you self-fund or using insurance, is the goal is not to pay for nursing home care. The goal should be to stay in your own home and to remain, as free as possible as far as that goes. So we really have 2 ways to go. We could try to insure the risk, or we can absorb the risk. If we absorb it, the question is, do I have enough assets to cover whatever I need to cover? If we insure it, then of course, we're transferring that risk to somebody else. The problem is, as you know, care is very expensive, and it's getting more so every day. Home care providers for certified home health aid, right now, it's going to be about $55,000 a year for 1 shift a day. My dad ended up with Parkinson's. And when it started, he needed someone to come in a couple hours a day just to help with a few things. Well, 10 years later, he had someone living there 24/7. And the cost was about $20,000 a month. It's $240,000 a year. Now, luckily he had long-term care insurance, and they hated him. because he didn't die for 13 years. So he racked up a lot of bills. Homemaker services are about $54,000 a year as well. So we're not talking skilled nursing care in the home. For a private room nursing home, the average now is about $106,000 a year. Call it $9,000 a month, all in when you include everything. Again, that's a lot of money. If you have a portfolio with $1 million, you're going to deplete that inside of 15 years. And the problem's not one person, it's when you're married and one person needs care, the other one still needs to live. So you can't deplete everything for one. And so we need to look at how do we protect ourselves. The average period of care, they say, is 2.5 years, but it's a little bit misleading because that's the average care in a facility. And typically, if someone makes it 1 year, the average caregiving is about 5. So once you make it past that first year, you need about 5 years of care. So for a nursing home, you're looking at $600,000, give or take. And for home care, it's probably $250,000 to $300,000. Now, one of the things that we touched on, and Ryan's going to talk about this some more, is when we have friends or family, or if we're a caregiver, we need to look at the impact of this. You know, if you're not able to bring in professional help or outside help, it can be exhausting to care for somebody. I can't tell how many clients, even when there's several kids, you know, I go over to see mom on Mondays and I go on Tuesdays. It gets to be very, very exhausting to do that. The average number of hours worked by unpaid caregivers who care for family members while working is about 34.7 hours a week. So it's almost like a second job. And then in a study that was done a couple years ago, and this was partially during COVID, which made it worse, the percent of caregivers who said they're getting insufficient sleep was about 36%. The percentage that said they had a lot of kind of anxiety was over 56. And the number who said, this is impacting my work, which how could it not, was about 70%. So even if someone's willing and maybe able, it's not necessarily the best situation to do that from that standpoint. So the key is to have a plan, as with anything. It can make it better for you, it can make it better for your children, for your family members. And the first thing is to kind of figure out and communicate, you know, what, if I need care, where do I want to have it? Do I want to stay at home? Do I want to go someplace? Do I want to move to assisted living? We have a lot of clients that really actually enjoy some of the 55 and up communities. In my case, my father was not the most social person, and my mother knew she was going to die, actually, moved him with her, or she moved with him, so he'd have a place to be with people. And it was great. It wasn't assisted living. It's 55 up, kind of like the place up the street, Parker Place. You know, a place like that. Just, or Danbury. You know, you have some social stuff. But talking to your family and thinking for yourself, you know, what are some of the contingencies? And then the second thing is, just with your estate planning, make sure you have powers of attorney for both medical and financial. You know, the problem's not if you die, it's if you're incapacitated. Can somebody sign documents and handle that? And that's important. If you have an IRA, for example, and your spouse doesn't have power of attorney, or your kids don't have power of attorney, they can't access that without going to court. With any Raymond James account, we can give you a boilerplate power of attorney if you don't have one. But we strongly recommend working with a lawyer to get a power of attorney, advanced healthcare directives, which they used to call a living will. It's confusing. I call it the unplug me. Do not resuscitate, but basically getting your estate planning in order. And then figure out, how are you going to fund this? How do we pay for it? Is it out of our assets? Is it insurance? Is it something else? And these are things we can discuss, with your advisor as well. So we really have two choices, as we said. You can insure against the risk, where you transfer all or most of the potential expense to an insurance company, or you can use your own assets. Now, certainly if somebody has sufficient assets, excuse me, that's fine. If you can generate enough income or have enough principal to pay and have your spouse or partner have enough assets, then that's great. If you can insure the risk and it makes sense, that may be something to look at as well. And in fact, we're going to touch base. A lot of states now are pushing to force people to get insurance, or they're going to give it to them at a cost, which we're going to finish up with. Now, there's three types of insurance. The first one, traditional long-term care insurance. It's like car insurance. You pay for it. If you don't use it, the money's gone. The price can go up. There's no guarantees. And typically it'll pay for between 3 and 5 years. They used to have policies like my dad's that would pay forever, but it's just almost impossible to get those anymore. This type of insurance, you really need to be between about 55 and 65. They will write it up to age 80, but it gets incredibly expensive, and there's no guarantees that the premiums won't continue to go up. The second type, which is kind of interesting, is life insurance or annuities, which have long-term care attached to it. We're seeing a lot more of this. One of the benefits is if it's a life long-term care policy, which means you can use the death benefit to pay for long-term care, pay for home care, pay for whatever you need, is if you file a claim, they're going to pay it pretty easily because they're going to pay it now or they're going to pay it later. So there's no incentive for the insurance company to fight the claim. Any benefits from that is tax-free. And this can be good if somebody already has a life policy they may not need. Maybe you've got an old life insurance with cash value. It's no longer needed. We can transfer it to a policy that gives you long-term care. The nice thing is if you don't use it, it goes to your kids or your heirs, income tax-free, and potentially estate tax-free as well. So if you don't use it, you're creating an estate for your kids or whomever your beneficiaries are. And then the last type of long-term care is really an annuity policy, which again offers some long-term care benefits. Typically it's 2 to 3 times what you put in premium. The underwriting is very easy. People say, well, I'm not perfectly healthy. Very few, 70 or 80-year-olds really are. But again, if someone has an old annuity, if someone has an old life policy, this may be something to look at utilizing. If someone has money that's sitting in the bank that they don't intend to use, but they need something as a fixed return, these will typically pay a little bit of interest, 3 to 4% interest. They're tax deferred, so the income doesn't affect Social Security or Medicare premiums. And when you pay, if you need them, you can use them for long-term care tax-free. And when you pass away, whatever's left will go to the heirs. So, a couple different options. Now, one of the things that's been happening, and this, quite frankly, in our opinion, is just a money grab by various states, and you may start to hear about this. There are now 14 states that are considering taxing people if they don't have their own long-term care policy. Now this passed in Washington State. Washington State had no income tax. It's like Florida, Texas. But now if you live in Washington, you pay a 0.58% income tax with no cap if you don't own long-term care. So the state's basically taxing everybody. And ostensibly it's to prop up Medicaid in the state, but the coverage they give you is so bad that it's, in my opinion, just a money grab. Basically, the total benefit lifetime is $36,500. So I pay for 3 months. Now, California's going to pass, not surprisingly, their tax next year, scheduled to kick in 2024. There are 14 other states. Ohio is not one of the ones that has a bill currently, but Pennsylvania does. And it seems like anything that happens around us ends up happening here. I would expect every state will do this eventually because it's a way to grab money. And again, Medicare is having a lot of issues, as is Medicaid. So you may hear about this, and essentially what it is, it's a small income tax on income used to pay for the long-term care. But again, if you have your own, whether it's a life policy, annuity policy, long-term care policy, then you're excluded from paying the tax. And so, it's one of those things, you have to do the math and say, hey, if the tax is $5,000 a year, am I better off just buying a policy? And it wouldn't be that much. As I say, in Washington, it's roughly half of 1%. So it's $580 on every 100,000 you make. Any questions on all of that before I bring Ryan up? Yes?
Is there, the states that are passing this, is there an age bottom for it, like when it starts?
Nope.
So like 20-year-olds are going to pay this tax?
They are. The question was, is there an age? So anybody has earned income, and there's no cap either. If you earn income, you're going to pay it up till you die. Yeah, and as I say, Washington had no state income tax. If you look at the states, you kind of see the pattern here, which states they are, obviously. But we'll see. No, there's no minimum age. Like I said, they'll pay up to $36,500. It's 45 days till you can collect. No portability. You can't carry it between spouses or go any place. And you can't collect for 10 years. It's a 10-year vesting as well. So yeah, it's a great program. If you Google it, if you just Google long-term care income tax, you can see kind of where it's at. As I say, there's nothing in Ohio at this time, and there's nothing planned at this time in Ohio. So it's not something I'd be overly concerned about. But I do think, I just want to make you aware, because you may hear about it. If you have questions, as I say, everybody's situation is different as you meet with your advisor. If you're a planning meeting, or if you have questions you think of, just give us a call, and we can address those as we go forward. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ryan. Ryan, I think I've known Ryan for a long time. Ryan has a lot of experience in estate financial planning. He speaks all over the country as far as a wide range of topics. He holds both the Certified Financial Planner designation. Also, he's a chartered life underwriter. And he's going to be speaking more about the caregiving. And again, I would draw your attention to the second handout, this toolkit, which has a lot of really great information. So with that, Ryan.
Thank you very much. Test. All right, I am live. I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Randy. As Randy mentioned, my name is Ryan Bertrand. I'm head of the Advanced Markets Department at Transamerica. Oftentimes I say advanced markets and I'm greeted with blank stares because most everyone has no idea what advanced markets is, what we do on a day-to-day basis. I think the easiest way to say it is we're subject matter experts in planning, specifically around planning for growing older. And our society, when you look at it currently, we are experiencing a revolution and we will continue to experience a revolution as technology and longevity continue to come together. And I think this presentation does a pretty good job of talking about some of the side effects that come along with that. Before I get into the content though, we did put this together about a decade ago and we used the best and the brightest in the entire world. We worked with the MIT AgeLab. So MIT is the think tank out in Boston, Massachusetts, really smart individuals. We put this content together alongside of them and people who have firsthand experience dealing with caregiving and the planning that comes along with it. So we engaged with top-tier financial advisors, top-tier academics to give you useful material in case you ever do run across this. And this is something that in every room I've ever spoken to, the majority of the room has some experience with this at some level. So just to give an idea of this, who here has ever known anybody who's had an Alzheimer's or a dementia diagnosis? Pretty much every hand in the room. This is sometimes something that's unspoken, something we don't necessarily always identify with individually, but there's a reason for this. We are growing older as a society, as the name of the presentation suggests, and it's something we've seen a massive revolution in a really short period of time, and this is having rippling, changing effects on our society. You go back to the beginning of human history. So you think back to the cavemen, the first person that was ever born, coming back to today. Does anyone want to guess what average life expectancy was from day one of Homo sapiens to today? How long was someone anticipated to live? Actually, I heard someone get it really close. 29. 29 years old is average life expectancy for a human being going back to day one. Now you think about who lives to age 29 and you look at 29-year-olds in contemporary society. Celebrities are a good litmus test for this. Justin Bieber is 29 years old and he is nowhere near the end of his life expectancy. You fast forward to 1918, which really is about 100 years ago and really not that long. This is our last global pandemic prior to COVID. Does anyone want to guess what life expectancy jumped to from the beginning of human time to 1918? What age? Here's 60s. You're really close with 45. 47 years old. So we went from 29 to 47. So only 100 years ago, you think about 47, we wouldn't be in this room talking about this topic 100 years ago. It's that quick that we've seen a longevity revolution. You look at celebrities that are 47 years old, that's DJ Khaled, Luke Bryan, and Reese Witherspoon. None of those are anywhere near the end of their life expectancy. They're going to be around for 40, 50 years after age 47, potentially even longer, which begs a question. How old can someone potentially live? And this is something science and biology has bantered about pretty carefully. And you go and you look at the oldest verified human being to ever live. Does anyone want to guess the age of the oldest person to have been verified alive? Here are a lot of people really close. 122 years old. 122 is the oldest verified person. This was Jean Calment out of France. She lived to 122, and I think she's a good precursor to our topic because there was some controversy around Jean and whether or not it was actually her when she passed away. There's controversy as to whether or not that in her 90s that she passed away and that her daughter assumed her identity to continue to get her checks as she potentially lived to age. So fraud is a big issue when we're talking about this, and I'll touch on that as we move through the presentation. But how old can we potentially live? February 2015, Time magazine cover. You've probably seen this Time magazine cover. On the cover is a picture of a really cute baby, and the proclamation in that Time magazine was that baby was born on planet Earth today is going to live to age 142. Now, the very next week, the Wall Street Journal, they said, Time magazine, we don't know what they're talking about. It's age 150. There's a Palo Alto professor, so a Stanford University professor, who proclaims that there's someone on Earth today that's going to live to age 200. Now, I'm not going to suggest we're going to live to age 200, 150, or 142, but it's really an open question. We don't know how long someone could potentially live. But what I would guess is that everyone in the room probably has experience with people who have grown significantly older. Now, I like to do a little impromptu survey, and I'm always trying to beat my record. I like to ask how old the oldest person you know is. So if you know someone who's 85 years old or older, raise your hand. How about 90? 95? How about 100? How about 105? 110? All the hands go down around 110. 113 is my record. And I've tied that on 3 separate occasions, twice in Southern California, once in Richmond, Virginia. But when I ask that question, and I ask this question to a lot of audiences across the country, and what I find universally, and you are no different, is more than half of the hands are up at age 95 or age 100. But you look at these individuals who have made it to these old ages, and 100 really isn't that old anymore when you think about it. There are people living beyond 100. You look at how they make it this far, and it's always interesting to look at their lifestyle and how they live to these old ages. There was a lady out of Scotland by the name of Jessie Gallen. Jessie Gallen's secret to longevity was eating oatmeal every day and staying away from men. So she never married. That was apparently one that got her to age 109. There's also out of America, a lady by the name of Susanna Jones. She lived to age 117. Her secret to living to age 117 was bacon. She would eat 4 strips of bacon in the morning and continue to eat bacon throughout the rest of the day. Even Jean Calment, her secret to longevity too, she would eat dessert after every meal, and following her dessert, she'd smoke a cigarette. Betty White, does everyone know Betty White? Dancing with the Stars, Golden Girl. How old was Betty White when she passed away? 99, almost made it to 100. What was her secret to longevity? Vodka and hot dogs. Now, she probably says that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but right in her wheelhouse. Probably positive, optimistic outlook on life. Obviously, a great sense of humor. But you look at Richard Overton, and he's one of my favorites. He was out of Austin, Texas. He made it to the ripe old age of 112. When he passed away, he was the oldest veteran in the United States. Now, I think he's a good example because he does a good job of illustrating, one, odd lifestyle habits to make it to age 112. He'd sit on his patio and he would smoke 12 Tampa Sweet cigars every single day throughout the course of a day and sip Irish whiskey. So or Irish coffee. He'd put whiskey in his coffee and continue to drink it. Now, the thing about Richard Overton that I think he also highlights an important point is it's very expensive to live to age 112. He lived to age 112, and he was spending $15,000 a month, $180,000 per year in order to maintain his lifestyle, his independence at that age. Now, the problem with Mr. Overton, like many other individuals who become vulnerable in their older age, is he was taken advantage of. Someone drained his bank account. He had 0 money left. And what ended up happening is the community in Austin, Texas, they rallied around him, and they set up a GoFundMe page, and they ended up funding $453,000 for him to continue his lifestyle. But fraud is a big issue here. Also, you look at catastrophic conditions, incapacitation as we get older, and specifically Alzheimer's and cognitive decline become significantly more prevalent at older age. So here you can see the statistics. 1 in 3 seniors pass away with some form of cognitive decline. Alzheimer's and dementia have a linear relationship with age. It is the #1 precursor as to whether or not you will have a diagnosis of dementia as age. You think about all the people that you know that are 65 years old, 1 in 10 of them, 1 in 9, will have an Alzheimer's or a dementia diagnosis. You jump to age 85, and that jumps to 1 in 3 of those people will have an Alzheimer's or a dementia diagnosis. So it is something that's extremely prevalent, and age is the #1 precursor. So the older we get, the more likely we're going to see this. And it's probably always been around. Generally, people weren't living long enough to be afflicted by it. So this is something that's continuing to change the aging side of the equation. And in addition, I think it's something that when we can spot it, when we can plan for it, I think planning, the reason that we do it is when things get bad, we need to be prepared for it. So just a little bit of planning here goes a long way. And in fact, I would take it beyond that. The planning is not related to Alzheimer's or dementia whatsoever. The planning is essential for everybody. Whether you're 30 years old and you're starting a family, whether you're 50 years old and you're changing careers, whether you're 65 and you're filing for Social Security and enrolling in Medicare, those are the ages that you should always revisit your plan, put the plan in place, because you never know what's going to happen. And anyone, regardless of their age, can be struck by incapacitation. But Alzheimer's and dementia are a little bit different. If you look at the 6 leading causes of death going back roughly the last 20 years, what you'd notice if you looked at their prevalence, most of them are in decline. So heart attack, stroke, cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, those are all in decline. Alzheimer's is increasing in prevalence. One, it doesn't have a cure. It's something that we know is progressive, and I think that's part of the equation here. If there's really 3 broad takeaways from this presentation, I think number 1 is to get somebody else involved. And I mean that in a very multifaceted sense. I mean that from a family sense. Communication with family is key in creating the plan to safeguard any incapacitation. Also, you need to have the right stable of professionals. That's your estate planning attorneys, your financial advisor. You need to have the best. That makes a huge difference. And I can think back to prior to the pandemic, and I was staying in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, right at the airport, the last hotel you would ever want to stay in. It was the worst hotel. It was nasty. It was gross. And I come down to the front desk, and there's a line of people out the door trying to get a room at that hotel. Turns out that they're all reporters. And the reporter that's talking to the front desk clerk is screaming at the top of his lungs trying to get a room. Because what's going on at the airport is Southwest Flight 1380 is parked at the gates. If you remember, Southwest Flight 1380 was the last air fatality in the United States on a commercial airline. What happened, and you probably will remember this as I start talking about it, there was a piece of the engine, the cowling, the ring around the engine, broke off, struck the side of the plane. The lady that was sitting in that seat basically got sucked out of the airplane. She was the lone fatality. Because if you go and you listen to the air traffic control from that flight, they were very lucky. The person at the helm of that flight was a lady by the name of Tammy Jo Schultz. Tammy Jo Schultz was the first female combat naval aviator. That's the person you want to have flying your plane when things go wrong. That's the professional you want in the cockpit navigating the most difficult waters. Everyone on that plane, other than that lady that got sucked out, survived. And she was cool as a cucumber talking to air traffic control. She could have been in a library, pandemonium, the oxygen masks out of the ceiling, people probably freaking out, and she was able to navigate it the right way. Now you contrast that to the last air fatality to Southwest Flight 1380. It was a Colgan Air flight going from Newark, New Jersey to Buffalo, New York. And that particular flight, they have the cockpit recording as well, and you can hear the cockpit even before they take off from the flight talking about the conditions, and they had to fly through an ice storm. The issue was they had never flown through an ice storm before. Ended up crashing, 49 people passed away, 1 on the ground, because they didn't have the right planning, they didn't have the right preparation. Preparing for when things are bad are extremely important, and being able to identify those things is important. So not only do we have to get the right people involved as the first takeaway, but we also have to act while we have capacity. When we talk about Alzheimer's and dementia, that can be very difficult to ascertain. It is a fine line. Once you go over that line, the planning window is completely closed. You'll notice I'm wearing a blue suit and an orange tie. It's very intentional. 1, I really love the color combination, but 2, I'm a huge Denver Broncos fan. We're a really terrible football team this year, but the reason I bring that up is Pat Bowlen was the previous owner of the Denver Broncos, very well heeled, $4.65 billion sale of the team, but the sale of the team was forced. He had kids from 2 previous marriages. There was a trust that was set up, and basically what happened was they were arguing as to whether or not that trust that was holding the team was put into place when he had capacity. So you have the best attorneys in the world, someone who has more money than he'll ever know what to do with, and still they had to force the sale and his intentions were not met. So this is something that's extremely important to do when you have capacity to do it. We don't want to go over that line and have that question, did I draft my directives? Did I put the plan into place when I didn't have capacity? So second takeaway, act while the window is open when you have capacity. And the third takeaway is to actually do the planning. This is the one people oftentimes overlook, the most important step. If you don't take that action step, the planning doesn't put into place and things start to fall apart. And this is where we start to see issues when we talk about finance, because when we talk about issues like Alzheimer's and dementia, really when we deal with financial planning, that's the first area that goes. You start reading through these warning signs. These are the 10 warning signs from the Alzheimer's Association on Alzheimer's diagnosis. You'll notice number 2, challenges in planning and problem solving. This is a critical one because unlike having a heart attack or being diagnosed with cancer, we do know that you can plan through those maladies. But you get diagnosed with Alzheimer's or you have dementia, the first area to go is your capacity to plan and problem solve. And fundamentally, what we're doing when we're putting together a financial plan is those items. So it's essential that we identify if there's something wrong in that area and move forward with it. And you read through the rest of them, and I would argue pretty much every one of them comes into the equation as far as making it difficult to put together a financial plan or even destroying the one that you currently have. You look at decrease or poor judgment in addition to the way that people start to act when they get diagnosed. And this is the issues that lead to vulnerability, exploitation. All of a sudden, someone new comes into your loved one's life and money starts flying out of the account. It's because of that decreased cognition and the change in behavior that ensues with it. So we have to understand that Alzheimer's and dementia face roadblocks fundamentally from a planning standpoint. You will lose that capacity. Now, of course, there's the caregiving side to it as well. And I think this one is extremely important because it's not just the individual that's going through the diagnosis. This is a real family problem. This is a problem we all face as a society. There is a price tag to it. You can look at it right now. We collectively spend $345 billion just on Alzheimer's alone in the country. That number with aging is supposed to increase by 2050 to $1.1 trillion per year just for this one issue. But there's also an emotional burden because everyone that goes through this has a network of people that support them, that provide care. And there's an emotional cost of this in addition to a real dollar cost as well. And this is something that can be very emotional for those people. You can see the numbers on the screen. There are 11 million caregivers providing 18 billion hours of care that's valued at roughly $340 billion collectively. Now, there's also the individual costs because those people that are providing care are going to forego $304,000 on average of wages and employer benefits. Additionally, there's the actual stated cost of a condition like Alzheimer's, and you can see it's extremely high, $392,000 on average. Anyone ever heard of the terminology sandwich generation? So the sandwich generation, I can remember when I started in financial services way back in 2001, they always talked about the financial dilemma faced by the baby boomers and the sandwich generation because they were supposedly the prototypical sandwich generation where they were caring for their kids and at the same time providing care for their family. You fast forward to today, and certainly that is true, but it continues. I would argue the millennials have now taken that herald torch and are now the sandwich generation of today. Demographically, this is very interesting because our family makeup has changed and aging and technology have weighed into this. You look at the age of an average mother, a first-time mother back in 1970. Does anyone want to guess the age of a first-time mother back in 1970? I heard the answer, 21. 21 years old. Does anyone want to guess what it is today?
18.
For the first time in history, it's over 30. Over 30 years old. So the millennials are delaying many major life milestones, which means that they're having children later in life, they're getting married later in life. And what that means is their parents are older when they're having children. So there's a very real possibility as a millennial that you're starting a family and in addition caring for an aging parent. And I'm a perfect example of this. We had twins in April. My parents, they're in their late 70s. My father just turned 80. My mom is 77. I'm 42 years old. I'm the leading edge of the millennials. So I'm going through this in real time as we talk about it. I'm in the sandwich. I'm the sandwich generation. And it is something that does come at a cost. Every time I go and I help my parents, because I would be considered a caregiver given the definition of providing care, every time I go down there, it's a 6-hour commitment. 6-hour commitment, and I help out with different things, different chores. Financial generally is the largest share of caregiving for most people. The financial side of it equates to 92%. The actual physical care, so the medical side of it, only comes into play 64% of the time. So both are extreme burdens for someone that's going through it, and certainly some planning for it and putting the right recipe in place to safeguard against it. It really isn't that difficult to do, but it pays so many dividends in the outcome when it is executed properly. And it is a difficult conversation to have, to confront somebody to say that you might be losing your capacity or your cognitive ability may be declining. It's very difficult to confront somebody about that, and a lot of families have issues around it. If you do the planning up front, and I think here, doing it at different age intervals makes a lot of sense. You should always continually revisit your plans especially when it pertains to incapacitation, to make sure things are updated. Should be done probably every 5 years at least, if not more frequent. I would say even annually for some of these directives is important, because if you don't do it and you go through this, the outcome can be somewhat catastrophic. I remember when I was in the 2nd grade, we moved from Denver, Colorado to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Sioux Falls, South Dakota recently in a poll was named the 2nd least likely place people want to take a vacation. Does anyone want to guess what number 1 was? Wilmington, Delaware. Wilmington, Delaware was number 1. So I moved to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Our neighbors at the time were an elderly couple, and turns out she has Alzheimer's and he's her caretaker. You fast forward, I'm in high school. He's changing a tire by the side of the road as the caretaker. He gets hit and killed by a drunk driver. Now what ends up happening is she disappears. I have no idea to this day, and it's one of those neighborhood things. Just sometimes people disappear in your neighborhood. But knowing what I know about the system, what probably happened to her, she didn't have a strong family network. They didn't have professionals in their corner making sure that they had the planning in place. So she ended up in what they call a guardianship or a conservatorship. So basically, she became a ward of the state, and someone was appointed to run her life. And I think one of the things that's lost sometimes in these questions about state-run programs or Medicaid is, what type of facility do you really end up in? Do you want to be there? Or do you want to drive the ship and drive your own car as to what type of facility you do go into if it does end up happening? But that's what happens if you don't have a plan. Now, I contrast that to my grandma's situation. And my grandma, she didn't have Alzheimer's, she didn't have dementia, but she did spend the last decade of her life in and out of assisted living facilities and nursing homes. Difference was, we had the planning in place. We had great financial professionals. We did all the gifting the right way. We had long-term care insurance. We had the estate plan. So when she went into a facility, she got to pick the one that she wanted to go into. And when she did inevitably pass away, the family didn't rip itself apart fighting over the crumbs and all the financial assets that were there. It made a world of difference. We had POAs so that when she did lose her capacity, my uncle could sign everything and make sure everything was taken care of for her. We didn't have to have that wild card of the state appointing someone to care for her. The planning makes all the difference. And that's the parable here, making sure that we get in front of it, put the planning in place, make sure we have the POAs, make sure we have the directives, the medical directives, the quality of what you want to have put into place if you do end up incapacitated, and then finally buttoning it up with the estate plan. And it's all very easy to do. But also when we talk about Alzheimer's and dementia, there's a medical side to it as well. And I find the medical side of this to be somewhat fascinating because it is something that's very misunderstood. Even the term Alzheimer's. A lot of times people don't realize that Alzheimer's isn't a standalone term. It is a type of dementia. And dementia and Alzheimer's basically are cognitive decline that impacts your ability on a day-to-day basis to run your own life. We had a doctor that used to work on my team, and he would describe Alzheimer's as what's going on in your brain. I thought he did a really good job of it, and it kind of cleared it up a little bit. But what it is your brain is made up of brain cells. Does anyone know the scientific term for a brain cell? It's a neuron. A neuron is a brain cell. You have over 100 billion neurons making up your brain. Now, in order for your brain cell to function, and in order for your brain to work, and for learning to happen, is your neurons need to make connections with each other. What's that called when it makes a connection, the scientific term? Synapse. It's a synapse. So in order for your brain cells to function and thrive, they need to make those connections. Those connections are the bedrock of memory, learning, everything mental that we have. What happens is those 100 trillion synapses, when we talk about someone who's afflicted with Alzheimer's, they get interrupted. There's this fancy term called beta amyloid. Beta amyloid is a plaque. And basically what happens is that plaque, the way you describe it, is it's a gunk. It covers your brain cell. It covers your brain cell and interferes your brain cell from making that necessary synapse with another brain cell. And when it doesn't make that connection, it starts to atrophy. Eventually, without that connection, your brain cell will die. That's one root cause of it. The second root cause is called a tau tangle. Tau is another fancy word. Tau is just a fancy word for a protein. That protein the doctor describes as a straw. The straw brings nutrients into the brain cell, and what happens with tau is it becomes tangled. The straw becomes kinked. And if you think about that straw, once that happens, it can no longer get the required nutrients into the brain cell, and likewise with beta amyloid, the brain cell eventually atrophies and will die. What's crazy about this is the amount of time it takes for it to actually start to show up. By the time someone's demonstrating symptoms of Alzheimer's, they've already had it going on in their brain for over 20 years. Your brain, when you start to become systematic, 70% of it is already afflicted, and the other 30% is doing the heavy lifting. So this takes a long time. But also, when you do start to show symptoms, we know how long the life expectancy is. So we know that it will be between 4 and 8 years on average when we have an Alzheimer's diagnosis for a life expectancy. Now, that's different in everybody. And I can think to a couple examples. My old boss's mom passed away from Alzheimer's, and she ended up living with it for over 20 years. And actually, she was very vivid. She had most of her mental faculty up until about year 18, and then had a massive stair step down. So it progresses differently in everybody, and we know there are 3 stages of decline when we go through this broadly. I think from a planning standpoint, the only stage that's really important is this first one, because this is the only one where there's any question at all as to whether or not there is any capacity to do planning. So hopefully the planning is already done in this stage. But when you are in this stage, making sure that you do think about the planning, that you have things organized, you know where to find things, becomes extremely important. And then we move into moderate decline. We need to make sure we know who our delegates are, because they're likely managing our day-to-day finances. And I know that my neighbor across the way, he passed away in February from Alzheimer's, and I moved into my house in 2018, and when I moved in there, he was already in the moderate stage of decline. And I remember having conversations with him. He'd go on walks in the neighborhood, I'd run into him, and we'd always have the same conversation. He'd ask me where I am, or where I was born. I'd tell him where I was born, and we'd have a conversation. He was born in Indonesia. And then during the moderate stage of decline, I could tell very quickly, every time I had a conversation with him, a little detail would be missing. To the point where when I finally talked to him for the last several times, he could just basically say a couple words, tell me how old he was, give me a hug, and then that was it. So this severe stage of decline, you're probably, everything's being done by a delegate. You're probably not independent at this point in time. You're going to be in an assisted living facility. So this is the final stage, and just making sure that you don't alienate someone who's in this stage. I think all the experts agree that the more you maintain that person's activity, the more you visit them, the more you try to keep them involved, the better the outcome is. Because if there is one safeguard against Alzheimer's, the Rush Center did a great study on this. Over 25 years, they looked at cadavers. They looked at cadavers and they looked at people's brains, and what they found is over 90% of the brains had those symptomatic tau tangles and beta amyloid plaques, but yet only 3% of the people showed any symptoms of Alzheimer's whatsoever. And what they found is the people that they theorize that the people who didn't show symptoms, they maintained social activity. They continued to learn throughout their life. They stayed active. They played an instrument. They learned new languages. So there is something to be said about the positive effect of continuing that lifelong thirst for learning, and maybe it has beneficial sides to it. Because lifestyle is one of the other symptoms or variables that we look at as far as whether an Alzheimer's or a dementia diagnosis will occur. And then third, genetics, you really can't control that side of it. But the financial side of it, we absolutely can control. We can't control the emotional, we can't control the social, we can't control the science. But we can control what we do to prepare for any type of incapacitation. And again, I wouldn't limit this just to dementia, Alzheimer's. This is anything that could be problematic from a health standpoint. So there are 5 areas of focus that we put together with MIT, and I think this does a really good roadmap on just the very rudimentary planning items we need to consider as we head into retirement. This is really a roadmap to retirement. You focus on these 5 areas, you'll probably do a pretty good job of buttoning up a very rudimentary estate plan and the guidelines for how you want to live your life during the last chapter. So intentions are a big one. And I think this is the one we can get into the weeds when we talk about the legal side of it, because this really is very rooted in law. The intentions are, who do I want to have as my powers of attorney? And if you look at powers of attorney, that's an important one, because oftentimes people will hear powers of attorney and there are different conceptions on what it is. I like to call it 31 flavors of powers of attorney. It's like Baskin-Robbins. Does anyone know when a power of attorney becomes invalid? Her death, it's actually a trick question. I ask a lot of trick questions, but basically it depends on the terminology. If I just say power of attorney, technically, it ceases to have form and effect upon incapacitation. Now, if I put 2 little words in front of that, general, durable, it will persist beyond incapacitation. So you can see in this one very small example, it's just an example of how that one detail makes all the difference. And then there's springing powers of attorney. There's medical powers of attorney. There's all these different flavors of powers of attorney. You need to give some thought as to which one is best for you, have the right conversations around it, and make sure it's communicated. That's one of the big areas that we see people fail quite a bit, because if you don't communicate with your powers of attorney and what you want to have happen, things can fall apart rather quickly. Or naming the wrong person as power of attorney is another major mistake that we see. If you have 2 kids, and we usually see with kids, you have the one really good kid, and maybe that kid that isn't so financially astute or doesn't do so good in school, maybe that one that isn't doing great in school or financially astute, maybe they're not your power of attorney. Maybe you have the better financially astute kid named as your power of attorney, because that can be a disaster. You name the wrong person. There was a good friend of mine whose grandma named the wrong power of attorney, and that power of attorney, because you're giving them the ability to run your financial life, drained your bank account. So fraud is something here. It's a very big responsibility to grant a power of attorney to somebody. Also, when it becomes effective, there are springing powers of attorney that will come into play upon the occurrence of a specific event, like incapacitation. So oftentimes we'll see a husband and a wife, one of them becomes incapacitated, and the power of attorney will spring into effect where the kid might be able to step in and exercise that power of attorney. So there's lots of terminology, there's lots that go into powers of attorney. Beneficiary designations, the estate plan, your wishes for where you want care provided and by who, that all falls into this, because your intentions are what going to build the rest of your plan. So you have to be very clear on the intention side of it. I think we do a pretty good job laying it out in that toolkit. And that toolkit, we've seen some people where they've had diagnosis of Alzheimer's or dementia, and just having something to provide some guidance goes a long way. It's very visceral. I know it seems like a silly piece of paper, but you give that to someone who's in a financial hardship and you give them some direction, and the complexion of the discussion changes drastically. Assets are another big one. And assets can be very difficult to corral because we tend to be scattered across all our different accounts. And even our employer plans that we get, our retirement plans, I think are a good example of this. And I think the millennials and the Generation Z are changing this discussion quite a bit as well. Because you look at the average American and you think about all the times they change jobs throughout their career. Does anyone want to guess the average amount of times an American changes jobs throughout their career? 12 to 16 times throughout their lifetime. Now again, I think the Generation Z and the millennials are going to drastically increase that because they seem to change jobs a lot. But you think about this for a second. If you have a plan from each one of those employers and you have 12 to 16 401ks or IRAs spread across all those plans, what's bound to happen? You're probably going to forget about some of them. It's going to be really difficult to meaningfully plan if things aren't consolidated or at least whittled down to less amounts. And this is something we can see in real time in different states because there are unclaimed property funds in every single state. And across the country, the amount that's left unclaimed in those funds is around $100 billion. So what that suggests to me is people just aren't communicating about where things are, because you may know where they are, but what about your beneficiaries? What about your spouse? What about your kids? What about the family? Communicating that is extremely important in this process. And it's very difficult sometimes to do it because people are very guarded with their finances. But I think just having that discussion in a meaningful way, or at least consolidating things where they can find it or have a delegate to do that, helps measurably. Also, we get different pieces of advice that can be somewhat misleading. I think this is where it talks to the individual aspect of getting the right advice. The one that drives me crazy is the let's transfer everything within 5 years of projecting to going into a facility. That could be good advice for the right person. It may be absolutely terrible advice for somebody else. Because what they're trying to accomplish there is qualifying for Medicaid. And if you're of means, that can be very difficult or impossible to do. So you could go through these undulations trying to impoverish yourself and never get there. So having the right expertise in this area and talking to the right people about whether or not that can even fit in your scenario works quite a bit. Income and insurance. This is another one where having some consolidation, streamlining things goes a long way. Because the bills, they still come in. If you have an incapacitation event, you have cognitive decline where you're forgetful, you still have to pay the bills on a monthly basis. That's where making sure that we have the income that matches those bills to come in and pay them when they're due is set up. Anything that's systematic here. You can imagine if you're becoming forgetful, if you think about withdrawing from accounts, it can be something that's very easily overlooked. You need systematic income, things that look like Social Security, things that look like pensions. The money comes in so it can go out and pay the bills. Also insurance. And this is another area where oftentimes we see people misunderstand what they have. Making sure that if you do have the prevalence of a specific condition in your family, that the insurance that you select has the coverage for it. And this is where we see eye-popping statistics. And even in the Alzheimer's and dementia world, you can look at recent developments. AgeLab and Leqembi are 2 FDA-approved drugs, but they come with a really steep price tag. So if your insurance isn't covering those or you don't have the right coverages, it may cost a lot out of pocket to get the right types of medication. They cost roughly $54,000. They cut it in half for AgeLab, which they argue it doesn't even work all that well. So there's even some question there. And Leqembi, the new one, costs about half of that, but it looks like it's going to be covered through Medicare Part B because it's an IV that you have to get as an outpatient. But making sure you have the right insurance and the right income to match helps out quite a bit. Then asking the right questions. Do I have everything streamlined? Is everything where I need it? And do I need anything supplemental? Banking administration, this is a small detail, but comes in huge when we talk about the details. Making sure your bills are paid. Automatic bill pay. That's a no-brainer. If you're becoming forgetful, you forget to pay a bill, this will make sure you do it. Also, overdraft protection. This is something we see quite frequently. Someone starts to take large withdrawals, especially with cognitive decline. We see those repetitively, and they can drain your account. So overdraft protection in this example. Also, making sure that you're using money management services if required or a delegate to manage money. In addition to some circumstances, if you have a high level of trust with the loved one, having them on a convenience account so they can step in and pay things if necessary. It's another small wrinkle when we talk about banking administration. And then the final area of the plan is care management. These are all those things that we were talking about as far as how do I want my care provided? What thought have I put into it? Who do I want to have provide it? And then making sure we take steps for it. Having the right organizations like Meals on Wheels to provide the daily occurrences, and then even going beyond that, the qualitative side. Do I want to be in which type of facility, which I think is something that's overlooked, but you have to have the right means to fit into that right facility if that's what best suits you. Now there is the emotional side to it as well, so I'll close up with 59% of Alzheimer's dementia caregivers have some type of depression, some type of issue. This is something where we can look at the caregiver stress signs. And you don't have to do a lot of reading on this list, but read through just the first couple words on each one of these. They're terrible. Denial, anger, social withdrawal, anxiety, depression, exhaustion, sleeplessness, irritability, lack of concentration, health problems. These are things when they manifest, they have a real physical manifestation for the person going through them. I had a friend who had to take care of his father. He moved across country to Raleigh, Durham. And when he moved across country, the care that he was providing, after a couple of weeks of doing it, he was completely overwhelmed, didn't realize everything that went into it, ended up in the emergency room, thought he was having a heart attack. Wasn't having a heart attack, he had a panic attack. The stress and anxiety becomes real and it manifests itself in those types of conditions. So this is something where if you ever find yourself as a caregiver, recognize that. There is respite care available. There are support mechanisms for you. It's something that can go a long way in your physical well-being. And then, of course, having the right conduits to the financial well-being and the material and support to go behind with it helps out increasingly much. So with that, I know it's a ton of information. There's a lot of good that can come from this. Again, 3 takeaways. Get someone else involved, the right stable of professionals, act while there's capacity, and of course, finally, put the plan into place, at least doing some planning and monitoring it on an ongoing basis. So with that, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
One of the last things I would suggest, and we do quite a few of these, are just a family meeting. Whether you do it on your own, you can come to our place, we can help facilitate. Meet with your kids, meet with your heirs, and just have the discussion. We can certainly do this without talking about dollar amounts, but have them understand what's out there. Understand a little bit of what your wishes are. Understand where the documents are. Who should they contact? You know, where's the title to the car? Where's this? Where's that? And so those types of meetings can be very, very helpful. You know, in Lake County, all the folks from Council on Aging, there's a lot of resources we can put you in touch with as far as that goes. But it really does come down, I think, to thinking about what your intentions are, what your wishes are, and then just communicating them. And that takes a little bit of work, but it can be well worth it. So with that, are there any other questions that he has? Yep, in the back.
I have a question regarding power of attorney.
Yes.
I have a power of attorney, but in dealing with several financial institutions, I was told by one, no, you need separate power of attorneys for our institution. Is that correct?
It's a good question. The question was, she has a power of attorney, but each institution, or in some cases, saying it has to be for them. Yes, that can be correct, because a general power of attorney, for example, with your IRA, and Ryan touched on this, power of attorney is not a power of attorney. So with Raymond James, the power of attorney has to specifically say, Raymond James IRA. Can't just say, I can do this or that. And it specifically has to outline what the powers are. Can that person name themselves as a beneficiary? Can they give themselves a gift? Or can't they? Can they give money to others? Or can they only give it to you? So it does get, we do recommend working with a lawyer, an attorney, for the power of attorney, not just printing something off the internet. In the case of our accounts, as I say, we do have specific boilerplate, they're free powers of attorney from Raymond James that'll work, and you can name whomever you wish. But if you're doing a general financial power of attorney, it is important to specifically name both the powers you're giving and the various accounts and entities. So, my IRA at Fifth Third Bank, they can do this. My IRA at Bank One, they can do that. But yes, that's true. And it's getting worse. The other one that if you do nothing else, you've got to get a medical power of attorney. Because most hospitals are not going to take instructions from a spouse anymore, because they don't want to get sued. And that power of attorney needs to be very, very specific. So medical power, financial power, and then, will or trust or something along with advanced healthcare directive, the, unplug me document. Any other questions? It's a good question. Yep.
I have a question. You said that the long-term care insurances, there's only like 2 companies in Ohio now that deal with it. What guarantee, is there any protection of any kind that if you take, if you sign up,
I know what you're saying.
you have a thing, then it's going to be there in 10 years?
Yeah, the state of Ohio, basically insurance companies that do business in the state will protect you. So for example, CNA doesn't sell policies in Ohio anymore, but they still have to meet the obligation. The big one left, I think, is Mutual of Omaha. Remember Marlon Perkins? No, I'm dating myself. Watch out, Jim. His teeth are razor sharp. It's Mutual of Omaha, and there are a couple other companies. Any other questions? No other questions? Okay, well, we appreciate you coming out. We do have some more events coming up. November 2nd, we're doing a town hall meeting. People can ask questions of our team with Dan and Raj and Nick. Those guys are going to be there answering questions about everything from Social Security to the election. January, we've got our annual resource breakfast. We just signed up a really cool speaker, so you have to watch for that. And then I know it's a long way off, but this is such a neat topic. In February, we have a guy named Chris DeSantis. He wrote a book called Why I Find You Irritating, Intergenerational Friction. And it's how, Gen Z versus millennial versus boomer, how to communicate and how people think differently. I'd highly recommend the book, but we've got him coming out February, so keep an eye for the postcards and the website and all the other garbage we send you. Anyway, well, thank you for coming. Have a good evening.